Chapter 1. Scarlett O'Hara was not beautiful, but men seldom realized it when caught by her charm. As the Tarleton twins were. In her face were too sharply blended the delicate features of her mother, a coast aristocrat of French descent, and the heavy ones of her florid Irish father. But it was an arresting face, pointed of chin, square of jaw. Her eyes were pale green without a touch of hazel, starred with bristly black lashes and slightly tilted at the ends. Above them, her thick black brows slanted upward, cutting a startling oblique line. In her magnolia white skin, that skin so prized by Southern women and so carefully guarded with bonnets, veils and mittens against hot Georgia suns. Seated with Stuart and Brant Tarleton in the cool shade of the porch of Tara, her father's plantation, that bright April afternoon of 1861, she made a pretty picture. Her new green-flowered muslin dress spread its 12 yards of billowing material over her hoops and exactly matched the flat-heeled green Morocco slippers her father had recently brought her from Atlanta. The dress set off to perfection the 17-inch waist, the smallest in 3 counties, and the tightly fitting basque showed breasts well matured for her 16 years. But for all the modesty of her spreading skirts, the demureness of hair netted smoothly into a chignon and the quietness of small white hands folded in her lap, her true self was poorly concealed. The green eyes in the carefully sweet face were turbulent, willful, lusty with life, distinctly at variance with her decorous demeanor. Her manners had been imposed upon her by her mother's gentle admonitions and the sterner discipline of her mammy. Her eyes were her own. On either side of her, the twins lounged easily in their chairs, squinting at the sunlight through tall mint-garnished glasses as they laughed and talked, their long legs, booted to the knee and thick with saddle muscles, crossed negligently. 19 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, long of bone and hard of muscle, with sunburned faces and deep auburn hair, their eyes merry and arrogant, their bodies clothed in identical blue coats and mustard-colored breeches, they were as much alike as 2 bowls of cotton. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted down in the yard, throwing into gleaming brightness the dogwood trees that were solid masses of white blossoms against the background of new green. The twins' horses were hitched in the driveway, big animals, red as their master's hair, and around the horses' legs quarreled the pack of lean, nervous possum hounds that accompanied Stuart and Brant wherever they went. A little aloof, as became an aristocrat, lay a black-spotted carriage dog, muzzle on paws, patiently waiting for the boys to go home to supper. Between the hounds and the horses and the twins there was a kinship deeper than that of their constant companionship. They were all healthy, thoughtless young animals. Sleek, graceful, high-spirited, the boys as mettlesome as the horses they rode. Mettlesome and dangerous but, withal, sweet-tempered to those who knew how to handle them. Although born to the ease of plantation life, weighted on hand and foot since infancy, the faces of the 3 on the porch were neither slack nor soft. They had the vigor and alertness of country people who have spent all their lives in the open and troubled their heads very little with dull things in books. Life in the North Georgia county of Clayton was still new and, according to the standards of Augusta, Savannah, and Charleston, a little crude. The more sedate and older sections of the South looked down their noses at the up-country Georgians, but here in North Georgia, a lack of the niceties of classical education carried no shame, provided a man was smart in the things that mattered. And raising good cotton, riding well, shooting straight, dancing lightly, squiring the ladies with elegance and carrying one's liquor like a gentleman were the things that mattered. In these accomplishments the twins excelled, and they were equally outstanding in their notorious inability to learn anything contained between the covers of books. Their family had more money, more horses, more slaves than anyone else in the county, but the boys had less grammar than most of their poor cracker neighbors. It was for this precise reason that Stewart and Brent were idling on the porch of terror this April afternoon. They had just been expelled from the University of Georgia, the fourth university that had thrown them out in 2 years, and their older brothers, Tom and Boyd, had come home with them, because they refused to remain at an institution where the twins were not welcome. Stewart and Brent considered their latest expulsion a fine joke, and Scarlett, who had not willingly opened a book since leaving the Fayetteville Female Academy the year before, thought it just as amusing as they did. "I know you two don't care about being expelled, or Tom either," she said. "But what about Boyd? He's kind of set on getting an education, and you two have pulled him out of the University of Virginia and Alabama and South Carolina and now Georgia. He'll never get finished at this rate." "Oh, he can read law in Judge Parmalee's office over in Fayetteville," answered Brent carelessly. "Besides, it don't matter much. We'd have had to come home before the term was out anyway." "Why?" "The war, goose. The war's going to start any day, and you don't suppose any of us would stay in college with a war going on, do you?" "You know there isn't going to be any war," said Scarlett, bored. "It's all just talk." "Why?" "Ashley Wilkes and his father told Pa just last week that our commissioners in Washington would come to an amicable agreement with Mr. Lincoln about the Confederacy. And anyway, the Yankees are too scared of us to fight. There won't be any war, and I'm tired of hearing about it." "Not going to be any war," cried the twins indignantly, as though they had been defrauded. "Why, honey, of course there's going to be a war," said Stewart. "The Yankees may be scared of us, but after the way General Beauregard shelled them out of Fort Sumter day before yesterday, they'll have to fight or stand branded as cowards before the whole world." "Why, the Confederacy?" Scarlett made a mouth of bored impatience. "If you say war just once more, I'll go in the house and shut the door. I've never gotten so tired of any one word in my life as war, unless it's secession. Pa talks war morning, noon and night, and all the gentlemen who come to see him shout about Fort Sumter and states' rights and Abe Lincoln till I get so bored I could scream. And that's all the boys talk about, too, that and their old troop. There hasn't been any fun at any party this spring because the boys can't talk about anything else. I'm mighty glad Georgia waited till after Christmas before it seceded, or it would have ruined the Christmas parties, too. If you say war again, I'll go in the house." She meant what she said, for she could never long endure any conversation of which she was not the chief subject. But she smiled when she spoke, consciously deepening her dimple and fluttering her bristly black lashes as swiftly as butterflies' wings. The boys were enchanted, as she had intended them to be, and they hastened to apologize for boring her. They thought none the less of her for her lack of interest. Indeed, they thought more. War was men's business, not ladies', and they took her attitude as evidence of her femininity. Having maneuvered them away from the boring subject of war, she went back with interest to their immediate situation. "What did your mother say about you two being expelled again?" The boys looked uncomfortable, recalling their mother's conduct 3 months ago, when they had come home, by request, from the University of Virginia. "Well," said Stewart, "she hasn't had a chance to say anything yet. Tom and us left home early this morning before she got up, and Tom's laying out over at the Fontaines while we came over here." "Didn't she say anything when you got home last night?" "We were in luck last night. Just before we got home that new stallion Ma got in Kentucky last month was brought in, and the place was in a stew. The big brute, he's a grand horse, Scarlett, you must tell your pa to come over and see him right away. He'd already bitten a hunk out of his groom on the way down here, and he'd trampled 2 of Ma's darkies who met the train at Jonesboro. And just before we got home, he'd about kicked the stable down and half killed Strawberry, Ma's old stallion. When we got home, Ma was out in the stable with a sackful of sugar, smoothing him down and doing it mighty well, too. The darkies were hanging from the rafters, popied, they were so scared, but Ma was talking to the horse like he was folks, and he was eating out of her hand. There ain't nobody like Ma with a horse. And when she saw us, she said, "In heaven's name, what are you for doing home again? You're worse than the plagues of Egypt." And then the horse began snorting and rearing, and she said, "Get out of here. Can't you see he's nervous, the big darling? I'll tend to you 4 in the morning." So we went to bed, and this morning we got away before she could catch us and left Boyd to handle her. Do you suppose she'll hit Boyd? Scarlett, like the rest of the county, could never get used to the way small Mrs. Tarleton bullied her grown sons and laid her riding crop on their backs if the occasion seemed to warrant it. Beatrice Tarleton was a busy woman, having on her hands not only a large cotton plantation, 100 Negroes and 8 children, but the largest horse breeding farm in the state as well. She was hot-tempered and easily plagued by the frequent scrapes of her 4 sons, and while no one was permitted to whip a horse or a slave, she felt that a lick now and then didn't do the boys any harm. Of course she won't hit Boyd. She never did beat Boyd much because he's the oldest. And besides, he's the runt of the litter, said Stewart, proud of his 6 feet 2. That's why we left him at home to explain things to her. God almighty, Ma ought to stop licking us. We're 19 and Tom's 21, and she acts like we're 6 years old. Will your mother ride the new horse to the Wilkes barbecue tomorrow? She wants to, but Pa says he's too dangerous. And, anyway, the girls won't let her. They said they were going to have her go to one party at least like a lady, riding in the carriage. I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow, said Scarlett. It's rained nearly every day for a week. There's nothing worse than a barbecue turned into an indoor picnic. Oh, it'll be clear tomorrow and hot as June, said Stewart. Look at that sunset. I never saw one redder. You can always tell weather by sunsets. They looked out across the endless acres of Gerald O'Hara's newly plowed cotton fields toward the red horizon. Now that the sun was setting in a welter of crimson behind the hills across the Flint River, the warmth of the April day was ebbing into a faint but balmy chill. Spring had come early that year, with warm quick rains and sudden frothing of pink peach blossoms and dogwood dappling with white stars the dark river swamp and far-off hills. Already the plowing was nearly finished, and the bloody glory of the sunset colored the fresh-cut furrows of red Georgia clay to even redder hues. The moist, hungry earth, waiting upturned for the cotton seeds, showed pinkish on the sandy tops of furrows, vermilion and scarlet and maroon where shadows lay along the sides of the trenches. The whitewashed brick plantation house seemed an island set in a wild red sea, a sea of spiraling, curving, crescent billows petrified suddenly at the moment when the pink-tipped waves were breaking into surf. For here were no long, straight furrows, such as could be seen in the yellow clay fields of the flat middle Georgia country or in the lush black earth of the coastal plantations. The rolling foothill country of North Georgia was plowed in a million curves to keep the rich earth from washing down into the river bottoms. It was a savagely red land, blood-colored after rains, brick dust in droughts, the best cotton land in the world. It was a pleasant land of white houses, peaceful plowed fields, and sluggish yellow rivers, but a land of contrasts, of brightest sun glare and densest shade. The plantation clearings and miles of cotton fields smiled up to a warm sun. Placid, complacent. At their edges rose the virgin forests, dark and cool even in the hottest noons, mysterious, a little sinister, the soughing pine seeming to wait with an age-old patience, to threaten with soft sighs, "Be careful. Be careful. We had you once. We can take you back again." To the ears of the three on the porch came the sounds of hooves, the jingling of harness, chains and the shrill careless laughter of Negro voices, as the field hands and mules came in from the fields. From within the house floated the soft voice of Scarlett's mother, Ellen O'Hara, as she called to the little black girl who carried her basket of keys. The high-pitched, childish voice answered "Yes, M," and there were sounds of footsteps going out the back way toward the smokehouse where Ellen would ration out the food to the homecoming hands. There was the click of china and the rattle of silver as pork, the valet butler of Tara, laid the table for supper. At these last sounds, the twins realized it was time they were starting home. But they were loath to face their mother and they lingered on the porch of Tara, momentarily expecting Scarlett to give them an invitation to supper. "Look, Scarlett. About tomorrow," said Brent. "Just because we been away and didn't know about the barbecue and the ball, that's no reason why we shouldn't get plenty of dances tomorrow night. You haven't promised them all, have you?" "Well, I have. How did I know you all would be home? I couldn't risk being a wallflower. Just waiting on you two." "You a wallflower?" The boys laughed uproariously. "Look, honey. You've got to give me the first waltz and Stu the last one, and you've got to eat supper with us. We'll sit on the stair landing like we did at the last ball and get Mammy Jinsey to come tell our fortunes again." "I don't like Mammy Jinsey's fortunes. You know she said I was going to marry a gentleman with jet black hair and a long black mustache, and I don't like black-haired gentlemen." "You like 'em red-headed, don't you, honey?" grinned Brent. "Now, come on, promise us all the waltzes and the supper." "If you'll promise, we'll tell you a secret," said Stuart. "What?" cried Scarlett, alert as a child at the word. "Is it what we heard yesterday in Atlanta, Stu? If it is, you know we promised not to tell." "Well, Miss Pitty told us." "Miss who?" "You know, Ashley Wilkes' cousin who lives in Atlanta, Miss Pitapat Hamilton Charles. And Melanie Hamilton's aunt." "I do, and a sillier old lady I never met in all my life." "Well, when we were in Atlanta yesterday, waiting for the home train, her carriage went by the depot and she stopped and talked to us, and she told us there was going to be an engagement announced tomorrow night at the Wilkes ball." "Oh, I know about that," said Scarlett in disappointment. "That silly nephew of hers, Charlie Hamilton, and Honey Wilkes. Everybody's known for years that they'd get married sometime, even if he did seem kind of lukewarm about it." "Do you think he's silly?" questioned Brent. "Last Christmas you sure let him buzz round you plenty." "I couldn't help him buzzing," Scarlett shrugged negligently. "I think he's an awful sissy. Besides, it isn't his engagement that's going to be announced," said Stuart triumphantly. "It's Ashley's to Charlie's sister, Miss Melanie." Scarlett's face did not change, but her lips went white like a person who has received a stunning blow without warning and who, in the first moments of shock, does not realize what has happened. So still was her face as she stared at Stuart that he, never analytic, took it for granted that she was merely surprised and very interested. "Miss Pitty told us they hadn't intended announcing it till next year, because Miss Melly hasn't been very well, but with all the war talk going around, everybody in both families thought it would be better to get married real soon. So it's to be announced tomorrow night at the supper intermission. Now, Scarlett, we've told you the secret, so you've got to promise to eat supper with us. Of course I will, Scarlett said automatically. And all the waltzes. All. You're sweet. I'll bet the other boys will be hopping mad. Let 'em be mad, said Brent. We too can handle 'em. Look, Scarlett. Sit with us at the barbecue in the morning. What? Stuart repeated his request. Of course. The twins looked at each other jubilantly but with some surprise. Although they considered themselves Scarlett's favored suitors, they had never before gained tokens of this favor so easily. Usually she made them beg and plead, while she put them off, refusing to give a yes or no answer, laughing if they sulked, growing cool if they became angry. And here she had practically promised them the whole of tomorrow's seats by her at the barbecue, all the waltzes, and they'd see to it that the dances were all waltzes, and the supper intermission. This was worth getting expelled from the university. Filled with new enthusiasm by their success, they lingered on, talking about the barbecue and the ball and Ashley Wilkes and Melanie Hamilton, interrupting each other, making jokes and laughing at them, hinting broadly for invitations to supper. Some time had passed before they realized that Scarlett was having very little to say. The atmosphere had somehow changed. Just how, the twins did not know, but the fine glow had gone out of the afternoon. Scarlett seemed to be paying little attention to what they said, although she made the correct answers. Sensing something they could not understand, baffled and annoyed by it, the twins struggled along for a while, and then rose reluctantly, looking at their watches. The sun was low across the new plowed fields and the tall woods across the river were looming blackly in silhouette. Chimney swallows were darting swiftly across the yard. And chickens, ducks, and turkeys were waddling and strutting and straggling in from the fields. Stuart bellowed, "Jeems!" And after an interval a tall black boy of their own age ran breathlessly around the house and out toward the tethered horses. Jeems was there. Body servant and, like the dogs, accompanied them everywhere. He had been their childhood playmate and had been given to the twins for their own on their 10th birthday. At the sight of him, the Tarleton hounds rose up out of the red dust and stood waiting expectantly for their masters. The boys bowed, shook hands and told Scarlett they'd be over at the Wilkes' early in the morning, waiting for her. Then they were off down the walk at a rush, mounted their horses and, followed by Jeems, went down the avenue of cedars at a gallop, waving their hats and yelling back to her. When they had rounded the curve of the dusty road that hid them from Tara, Brent drew his horse to a stop under a clump of dogwood. Stuart halted, too, and the dark boy pulled up a few paces behind them. The horses, feeling slack reins, stretched down their necks to crop the tender spring grass, and the patient hounds lay down again in the soft red dust and looked up longingly at the chimney swallows circling in the gathering dusk. Brent's wide ingenuous face was puzzled and mildly indignant. "Look," he said. "Don't it look to you like she would have asked us to stay for supper?" "I thought she would," said Stuart. "I kept waiting for her to do it, but she didn't." "What do you make of it?" "I don't make anything of it. But it just looks to me like she might have. After all, it's our first day home and she hasn't seen us in quite a spell. And we had lots more things to tell her. It looked to me like she was mighty glad to see us when we came." "I thought so, too. And then, about a half hour ago, she got kind of quiet, like she had a headache." I noticed that, but I didn't pay it any mind then. What do you suppose ailed her? I dunno. Do you suppose we said something that made her mad? They both thought for a minute. I can't think of anything. Besides, when Scarlett gets mad, everybody knows it. She don't hold herself in like some girls do. Yes, that's what I like about her. She don't go around being cold and hateful when she's mad. She tells you about it. But it was something we did or said that made her shut up talking and look sort of sick. I could swear she was glad to see us when we came and was aiming to ask us to supper. You don't suppose it's because we got expelled? Hell, no. Don't be a fool. She laughed like everything when we told her about it. And besides, Scarlett don't set any more store by book learning than we do. Brent turned in the saddle and called to the Negro groom. Jeems. Sue. You heard what we were talking to Miss Scarlett about? Naw sah, Mist Brent. How come you think I'll be spying on white folks? Spying, my God. You darkies know everything that goes on. Why, you liar, I saw you with my own eyes sidle round the corner of the porch and squat in the Cape Jessamine bush by the wall. Now, did you hear us say anything that might have made Miss Scarlett mad or hurt her feelings? Thus appealed to, Jeems gave up further pretense of not having overheard the conversation and furrowed his black brow. Naw sah, I didn't notice y'all say anything ter mek her mad. Look ter me lak she show glad ter see you and show had missed you, and she cheep along happy as a bird, tell bout de time y'all got ter talkin' bout Mist Ashley and Miss Melly Hamilton gittin' maed. Den she quiet down lak a bird and a hawk fly over. The twins looked at each other and nodded, but without comprehension. Jeems is right. But I don't see why, said Stewart. My lord. Ashley don't mean anything to her, cept a friend. She's not crazy about him. It's us she's crazy about. Brent nodded in agreement. But do you suppose, he said, that maybe Ashley hadn't told her he was going to announce it tomorrow night and she was mad at him for not telling her, an old friend, before he told everybody else? Girls set a big store on knowing such things first. Well, maybe. But what if he hadn't told her it was tomorrow? It was supposed to be a secret and a surprise, and a man's got a right to keep his own engagement quiet, hasn't he? We wouldn't have known it if Miss Melly's aunt hadn't let it out. But Scarlett must have known he was going to marry Miss Melly sometime. Why, we've known it for years. The Wilkes and Hamiltons always marry their own cousins. Everybody knew he'd probably marry her someday, just like Honey Wilkes is going to marry Miss Melly's brother, Charles. Well, I give it up. But I'm sorry she didn't ask us to supper. I swear I don't want to go home and listen to Ma take on about us being expelled. It isn't as if this was the first time. Maybe Boyd will have smoothed her down by now. You know what a slick talker that little varmint is. You know he always can smooth her down. Yes, he can do it, but it takes Boyd time. He has to talk around in circles till Ma gets so confused that she gives up and tells him to save his voice for his law practice. But he ain't had time to get good started yet. Why, I'll bet you Ma is still so excited about the new horse that she'll never even realize we're home again till she sits down to supper tonight and sees Boyd. And before supper is over she'll be going strong and breathing fire. And it'll be 10 o'clock before Boyd gets a chance to tell her that it wouldn't have been honorable for any of us to stay in college after the way the chancellor talked to you and me. And it'll be midnight before he gets her turned around to where she's so mad at the chancellor she'll be asking Boyd why he didn't shoot him. No, we can't go home till after midnight. The twins looked at each other glumly. They were completely fearless of wild horses, shooting affrays and the indignation of their neighbors, but they had a wholesome fear of their red-haired mother's outspoken remarks and the riding crop that she did not scruple to lay across their breeches. "Well, look," said Brent. "Let's go over to the Wilkes. Ashley and the girls'll be glad to have us for supper." Stuart looked a little discomforted. "No, don't let's go there. They'll be in a stew getting ready for the barbecue tomorrow. And besides—" "Oh, I forgot about that," said Brent hastily. "No, don't let's go there." They clucked to their horses and rode along in silence for a while, a flush of embarrassment on Stuart's brown cheeks. Until the previous summer, Stuart had courted India Wilkes with the approbation of both families and the entire county. The county felt that perhaps the cool and contained India Wilkes would have a quieting effect on him. They fervently hoped so, at any rate. And Stuart might have made the match, but Brent had not been satisfied. Brent liked India, but he thought her mighty plain and tame, and he simply could not fall in love with her himself to keep Stuart company. That was the first time the twins' interests had ever diverged, and Brent was not Kathleen. I'll lay you 2-1 she didn't even know the fort was out there in the harbor, much less that it was full of Yankees until we shelled them out. All she'll know about is the balls she went to and the bows she collected. Well, it's fun to hear her gabble. And it'll be somewhere to hide out till Ma has gone to bed. Well, hell. I like Kathleen and she is fun, and I'd like to hear about Carteret and the rest of the Charleston folks, but I'm damned if I can stand sitting through another meal with that Yankee stepmother of hers. Don't be too hard on her, Stuart. She means well. I'm not being hard on her. I feel sorry for her, but I don't like people I've got to feel sorry for. And she fusses around so much, trying to do the right thing and make you feel at home, that she always manages to say and do just exactly the wrong thing. She gives me the fidgets. And she thinks Southerners are wild barbarians. She even told Ma so. She's afraid of Southerners. Whenever we're there she always looks scared to death. She reminds me of a skinny hen perched on a chair, her eyes kind of bright and blank and scared, all ready to flap and squawk at the slightest move anybody makes. Well, you can't blame her. You did shoot Kate in the leg. Well, I was liquored up or I wouldn't have done it, said Stuart. And Kate never had any hard feelings. Neither did Kathleen or Rayford or Mr. Calvert. It was just that Yankee stepmother who squalled and said I was a wild barbarian and decent people weren't safe around uncivilized Southerners. Well, you can't blame her. She's a Yankee and ain't got very good manners, and, after all, you did shoot him and he is her stepson. Well, hell. That's no excuse for insulting me. You are Ma's own blood son, but did she take on that time Tony Fontaine shot you in the leg? No, she just sent for old Doc Fontaine to dress it and asked the doctor what ailed Tony's aim. Said she guessed liquor was spoiling his marksmanship. Remember how mad that made Tony? Both boys yelled with laughter. Ma's a card, said Brent with loving approval. You can always count on her to do the right thing and not embarrass you in front of folks. Yes, but she's mighty liable to talk embarrassing in front of father and the girls when we get home tonight, said Stuart gloomily. Look, Brent. I guess this means we don't go to Europe. You know Mother said if we got expelled from another college we couldn't have our grand tour. Well, hell. We don't care, do we? What is there to see in Europe? I'll bet those foreigners can't show us a thing we haven't got right here in Georgia. I'll bet their horses aren't as fast or their girls as pretty, and I know damn well they haven't got any rye whiskey that can touch father's. Ashley Wilkes said they had an awful lot of scenery and music. Ashley liked Europe. He's always talking about it. Well, you know how the Wilkes are. They are kind of queer about music and books. And scenery. Mother says it's because their grandfather came from Virginia. She says Virginians set quite a store by such things. They can have give me a good horse to ride and some good liquor to drink and a good girl to court and a bad girl to have fun with, and anybody can have their Europe. What do we care about missing the tour? Suppose we were in Europe now, with the war coming on? We couldn't get home soon enough. I'd heap rather go to a war than go to Europe. So would I, any day. Look, Brent. I know where we can go for supper. Let's ride across the swamp to Abel Winder's place and tell him we're all for home again and ready for drill. That's an idea, cried Brent with enthusiasm. And we can hear all the news of the troop and find out what color they finally decided on for the uniforms. If it's zouave, I'm damned if I'll go in the troop. I'd feel like a sissy in those baggy red pants. They look like ladies' red flannel drawers to me. Is y'all aimin' ter go ter Mist Winders? Cause if you is, you ain't gwine git much supper, said Jeems. Dey cook done died, and dey and bought a new one. Dey got a fail. Han cookin', and de niggers tells me she is de wustest cook in de state. Good God. Why don't they buy another cook? Hucome po wi trash by any niggers? Dey an never owned monfo at de mosts. There was frank contempt in Jeems' voice. His own social status was assured because the Tarletons owned 100 Negroes and, like all slaves of large planters, he looked down on small farmers whose slaves were few. I'm going to beat your hide off for that, cried Stewart fiercely. Don't you call Abel Winder po white? Sure he's poor, but he ain't trash, and I'm damned if I'll have any man, dark or white, throwing off on him. There ain't a better man in this county, or why else did the troop elect him lieutenant? And never figured dat out, Mossif, replied Jeems, undisturbed by his master's scowl. Look ter me lak dey'd lect all de officers from rich gempmum, stead of swamp trash. He ain't trash. Do you mean to compare him with real white trash like the Slatterys? Abel just ain't rich. He's a small farmer, not a big planter, and if the boys thought enough of him to elect him lieutenant, then it's not for any darka to talk impudent about him. The troop knows what it's doing. The troop of cavalry had been organized 3 months before, the very day that Georgia seceded from the Union, and since then the recruits had been whistling for war. The outfit was as yet unnamed, though not for want of suggestions. Everyone had his own idea on that subject and was loath to relinquish it, just as everyone had ideas about the color and cut of the uniforms. Clayton Wildcats, Fire Eaters, North Georgia Hussars, Zouaves, the Inland Rifles, although the troop was to be armed with pistols, sabers, and bowie knives, and not with rifles, the Clayton Greys, the Blood and Thunderers, the Rough and Readies, all had their adherents. Until matters were settled, everyone referred to the organization as the troop and, despite the high-sounding name finally adopted, they were known to the end of their usefulness simply as the troop. The officers were elected by the members, for no one in the county had had any military experience except a few veterans of the Mexican and Seminole Wars and, besides, the troop would have scorned a veteran as a leader if they had not personally liked him and trusted him. Everyone liked the 4 Tarleton boys and the 3 Fontaines, but regretfully refused to elect them, because the Tarletons got liquored up too quickly and Like to Skylark, and the Fontaines had such quick, murderous tempers. Ashley Wilkes was elected captain, because he was the best rider in the county and because his cool head was counted on to keep some semblance of order. Rayford Calvert was made first lieutenant, because everybody liked Rafe, and Abel Winder, son of a swamp trapper, himself a small farmer, was elected second lieutenant. Abel was a shrewd, grave giant, illiterate, kind of heart, older than the other boys and with as good or better manners in the presence of ladies. There was little snobbery in the troop. Too many of their fathers and grandfathers had come up to wealth from the small farmer class for that. Moreover, Abel was the best shot in the troop, a real sharpshooter who could pick out the eye of a squirrel at 75 yards, and, too, he knew all about living outdoors, building fires in the rain, tracking animals, and finding water. The troop bowed to real worth, and moreover, because they liked him, they made him an officer. He bore the honor gravely and with no untoward conceit, as though it were only his due. But the planters' ladies and the planters' slaves could not overlook the fact that he was not born a gentleman, even if their menfolks could. In the beginning, the troop had been recruited exclusively from the sons of planters, a gentleman's outfit, each man supplying his own horse, arms, equipment, uniform and body servant. But rich planters were few in the young county of Clayton, and, in order to muster a full-strength troop, it had been necessary to raise more recruits among the sons of small farmers, hunters in the backwoods, swamp trappers, crackers and, in a very few cases, even poor whites, if they were above the average of their class. These latter young men were as anxious to fight the Yankees, should war come, as were their richer neighbors, but the delicate question of money arose. Few small farmers owned horses. They carried on their farm operations with mules, and they had no surplus of these, seldom more than 4. The mules could not be spared to go off to war. Even if they had been acceptable for the troop, which they emphatically were not. As for the poor whites, they considered themselves well off if they owned one mule. The backwoods folks and the swamp dwellers owned neither horses nor mules. They lived entirely off the produce of their lands and the game in the swamp, conducting their business generally by the barter system and seldom seeing $5 in cash a year. And horses and uniforms were out of their reach. But they were as fiercely proud in their poverty as the planters were in their wealth, and they would accept nothing that smacked of charity from their rich neighbors. So, to save the feelings of all and to bring the troop up to full strength, Scarlett's father, John Wilkes, Buck Monroe, Jim Tarleton, Hugh Calvert, in fact every large planter in the county with the one exception of Angus McIntosh, had contributed money to completely outfit the troop, horse and man. The upshot of the matter was that every planter agreed to pay for equipping his own sons, and a certain number of the others, but the manner of handling the arrangements was such that the less wealthy members of the outfit could accept horses and uniforms without offense to their honor. The troop met twice a week in Jonesboro to drill and to pray for the war to begin. Arrangements had not yet been completed for obtaining the full quota of horses, but those who had horses performed what they imagined to be cavalry maneuvers in the field behind the courthouse, kicked up a great deal of dust, yelled themselves hoarse, and waved the Revolutionary War swords that had been taken down from parlor walls. Those who, as yet, had no horses sat on the curb in front of Bullitt's store and watched their mounted comrades, chewed tobacco and told yarns, or else engaged in shooting matches. There was no need to teach any of the men to shoot. Most Southerners were born with guns in their hands, and lives spent in hunting had made marksmen of them. All From planters' homes and swamp cabins, a varied array of firearms came to each muster. There were long squirrel guns that had been new when first the Alleghenies were crossed, old muzzle loaders that had claimed many an Indian when Georgia was new, horse pistols that had seen service in 1812, in the Seminole Wars and in Mexico. Silver-mounted dueling pistols, pocket derringers, double-barreled hunting pieces and handsome new rifles of English make with shining stocks of fine wood. Drill always ended in the saloons of Jonesboro, and by nightfall so many fights had broken out that the officers were hard put to ward off casualties until the Yankees could inflict them. It was during one of these brawls that Stuart Tarleton had shot Cade Calvert and Tony Fontaine had shot Brent. The twins had been at home, freshly expelled from the University of Virginia, at the time the troop was organized, and they had joined enthusiastically, but after the shooting episode, 2 months ago, their mother had packed them off to the State University, with orders to stay there. They had sorely missed the excitement of the drills while away, and they counted education well lost if only they could ride and yell and shoot off rifles in the company of their friends. "Well, let's cut across country to Abel's," suggested Brent. "We can go through Mr. O'Hara's river bottom and the Fontaines' pasture and get there in no time." "We ain't gwine get nothin' ter eat 'cept possum and greens," argued Jeems. "You ain't going to get anything," grinned Stuart. "Because you are going home and tell Ma that we won't be home for supper." "No, Ann," cried Jeems in alarm. "No, Ann. Don't get no mo fun outer havin' Miss Beatrice lay me out dan y'all does. Fust place she'll ast me huckom I'll let y'all get expelled agin. And next thing, huckom didn't bring y'all home ternight so she could lay you out. And den she'll light on me like a duck on a June bug, and fust thing I know I'll be ter blame for it all. Ef y'all don't tek me ter Mist Winders, I'll lay out in the woods all night and maybe de paterolus get me, cause a heap ruther de paterolus get me. Dan Miss Beatrice when she in a state." The twins looked at the determined black boy in perplexity and indignation. He'd be just fool enough to let the paterolus get him, and that would give Ma something else to talk about for weeks. "I swear, darkies are more trouble. Sometimes I think the abolitionists have got the right idea." "Well, it wouldn't be right to make Jeems face what we don't want to face. We'll have to take him. But, look, you impudent black fool, if you put on any airs in front of the Winder darkies and hint that we all the time have fried chicken and ham, while they don't have nothing but rabbit and possum, I'll tell Ma. And we won't let you go to the war with us, either." "Airs? Me put on airs fo dem cheap niggers? Naw sah, I got better manners. And Miss Beatrice taught me manners same as she taught y'all." "She didn't do a very good job on any of the three of us," said Stuart. "Come on, let's get going." He backed his big red horse and then, putting spurs to his side, lifted him easily over the split rail fence into the soft field of Gerald O'Hara's plantation. Brent's horse followed. And then Jeems, with Jeems clinging to pommel and mane. Jeems did not like to jump fences, but he had jumped higher ones than this in order to keep up with his masters. As they picked their way across the red furrows and down the hill too, resentful of his brother's attentions to a girl who seemed to him not at all remarkable. Then, last summer at a political speaking in a grove of oak trees at Jonesboro, they both suddenly became aware of Scarlett O'Hara. They had known her for years, and, since their childhood, she had been a favorite playmate, for she could ride horses and climb trees almost as well as they. But now to their amazement she had become a grown-up young lady and quite the most charming one in all the world. They noticed for the first time how her green eyes danced, how deep her dimples were. When she laughed, how tiny her hands and feet and what a small waist she had. Their clever remarks sent her into merry peals of laughter and, inspired by the thought that she considered them a remarkable pair, they fairly outdid themselves. It was a memorable day in the life of the twins. Thereafter, when they talked it over, they always wondered just why they had failed to notice Scarlett's charms before. They never arrived at the correct answer, which was that Scarlett on that day had decided to make them notice. She was constitutionally unable to endure any man being in love with any woman not herself, and the sight of India Wilkes and Stewart at the speaking had been too much for her predatory nature. Not content with Stewart alone, she had set her cap for Brent as well, and with a thoroughness that overwhelmed the two of them. Now they were both in love with her, and India Wilkes and Letty Monroe, from Lovejoy, whom Brent had been half-heartedly courting, were far in the back of their minds. Just what the loser would do, should Scarlett accept either one of them, the twins did not ask. They would cross that bridge when they came to it. For the present they were quite satisfied to be in accord again about one girl, for they had no jealousies between them. It was a situation which interested the neighbors and annoyed their mother, who had no liking for Scarlett. "It will serve you right if that sly piece does accept one of you," she said. "Or maybe she'll accept both of you, and then you'll have to move to Utah, if the Mormons'll have you, which I doubt. All that bothers me is that some one of these days you're both going to get liquored up and jealous of each other about that two-faced, little, green-eyed baggage, and you'll shoot each other. But that might not be a bad idea either." Since the day of the speaking, Stewart had been uncomfortable in India's presence. Not that India ever reproached him or even indicated by look or gesture that she was aware of his abruptly changed allegiance. She was too much of a lady. But Stewart felt guilty and ill at ease with her. He knew he had made India love him, and he knew that she still loved him, and, deep in his heart, he had the feeling that he had not played the gentleman. He still liked her tremendously and respected her for her cool good breeding, her book learning, and all the sterling qualities she possessed. But, damn it, she was just so pallid and uninteresting and always the same, besides Scarlett's bright and changeable charm. You always knew where you stood with India, and you never had the slightest notion with Scarlett. That was enough to drive a man to distraction, but it had its charm. "Well, let's go over to Kate Calvert's and have supper." Scarlett said Kathleen was home from Charleston. "Maybe she'll have some news about Fort Sumter that we haven't heard." Chapter 2. When the twins left Scarlett standing on the porch of Tara and the last sound of flying hooves had died away, she went back to her chair like a sleepwalker. Her face felt stiff as from pain, and her mouth actually hurt from having stretched it, unwillingly, in smiles to prevent the twins from learning her secret. She sat down wearily, tucking one foot under her, and her heart swelled up with misery, until it felt too large for her bosom. It beat with odd little jerks, her hands were cold, and a feeling of disaster oppressed her. There were pain and bewilderment in her face, the bewilderment of a pampered child who has always had her own way for the asking, and who now, for the first time, was in contact with the unpleasantness of life. Ashley to marry Melanie Hamilton. Oh, it couldn't be true. The twins were mistaken. They were playing one of their jokes on her. Ashley couldn't be in love with her. Nobody could, not with a mousy little person like Melanie. Scarlett recalled with contempt Melanie's thin childish figure, her serious heart-shaped face that was plain almost to homeliness. And Ashley couldn't have seen her in months. He hadn't been in Atlanta more than twice since the house party he gave last year at 12 Oaks. No, Ashley couldn't be in love with Melanie. Because she couldn't be mistaken, because he was in love with her. She, Scarlett, was the one he loved, she knew it. Scarlett heard Mammy's lumbering tread shaking the floor of the hall, and she hastily untucked her foot and tried to rearrange her face in more placid lines. It would never do for Mammy to suspect that anything was wrong. Mammy felt that she owned the O'Hara's body and soul, that their secrets were her secrets, and even a hint of a mystery was enough to set her upon the trail as relentlessly as a bloodhound. Scarlett knew from experience that, if Mammy's curiosity were not immediately satisfied, she would take up the matter with Ellen, and then Scarlett would be forced to reveal everything to her mother, or think up some plausible lie. Mammy emerged from the hall, a huge old woman with the small, shrewd eyes of an elephant. She was shining black, pure African, devoted to her last drop of blood to the O'Hara's, Ellen's mainstay, the despair of her 3 daughters, the terror of the other house servants. Mammy was black, but her code of conduct and her sense of pride were as high as or higher than those of her owners. She had been raised in the bedroom of Solange Robillard, Ellen O'Hara's mother, a dainty, cold, high-nosed French woman, who spared neither her children nor her servants their just punishment for any infringement of decorum. She had been Ellen's mammy and had come with her from Savannah to the up-country when she married. Whom Mammy loved, she chastened. And, as her love for Scarlett and her pride in her were enormous, the chastening process was practically continuous. Is de Jempmum gone? Hucome you din ast dem ter stay for supper, Miss Scarlett? Ah. Dun tol poke ter lay 2 extra plates for dem. War's yo manners. Oh, I was so tired of hearing them talk about the war that I couldn't have endured it. Through supper, especially with Pa joining in and shouting about Mr. Lincoln. You an got no mo manners dan a el han, and after Miss Ellen and me done labored wid you. And hiya you is without yo shawl. And de night air fixin' ter set in. Ah dun tol. You and tol you bout gittin' fever from settin' in de night air wid nothin' on yo shoulders. Come on in de house, Miss Scarlett. Scarlett turned away from Mammy with studied nonchalance, thankful that her face had been unnoticed in Mammy's preoccupation with the matter of the shawl. No, I want to sit here and watch the sunset. It's so pretty. You run get my shawl. Please. Mammy, and I'll sit here till Pa comes home. Yo voice son lak you catchin' a coal, said Mammy suspiciously. Well, I'm not, said Scarlett impatiently. You fetch me my shawl. Mammy waddled back into the hall and Scarlett heard her call softly up the stairwell to the upstairs maid. You, Rosa. Drap me Miss Scarlett's shawl. Then, more loudly, wuthless nigger. She. And never wore she does nobody no good. Now, I got ter climb up and get it massive. Scarlett heard the stairs groan and she got softly to her feet. When Mammy returned she would resume her lecture on Scarlett's breach of hospitality, and Scarlett felt that she could not endure prating about such a trivial matter when her heart was breaking. As she stood, hesitant, wondering where she could hide until the ache in her breast subsided a little, a thought came to her, bringing a small ray of hope. Her father had ridden over to 12 Oaks, the Wilkes plantation, that afternoon to offer to buy Dulce, the broad wife of his valet, pork. Dulce was head woman and midwife at 12 Oaks. And, since the marriage 6 months ago, Pork had deviled his master night and day to buy Dulce, so the two could live on the same plantation. That afternoon, Gerald, his resistance worn thin, had set out to make an offer for Dulce. Surely, thought Scarlett, Pa will know whether this awful story is true. Even if he hasn't actually heard anything this afternoon, perhaps he's noticed something, sensed some excitement in the Wilkes family. If I can just see him privately before supper, perhaps I'll find out the truth that it's just one of the twins' nasty practical jokes. It was time for Gerald's return and, if she expected to see him alone, there was nothing for her to do except meet him where the driveway entered the road. She went quietly down the front steps, looking carefully over her shoulder to make sure Mammy was not observing her from the upstairs windows. Seeing no broad black face, turbaned in snowy white, peering disapprovingly from between fluttering curtains, she boldly snatched up her green-flowered skirts and sped down the path toward the driveway as fast as her small ribbon-laced slippers would carry her. The dark cedars on either side of the graveled drive met in an arch overhead, turning the long avenue into a dim tunnel. As soon as she was beneath the gnarled arms of the cedars, she knew she was safe from observation from the house and she slowed her swift pace. She was panting, for her stays were laced too tightly to permit much running. But she walked on as rapidly as she could. Soon she was at the end of the driveway and out on the main road, but she did not stop until she had rounded a curve that put a large clump of trees between her and the house. Flushed and breathing hard, she sat down on a stump to wait for her father. It was past time for him to come home, but she was glad that he was late. The delay would give her time to quiet her breathing and calm her face so that his suspicions would not be aroused. Every moment she expected to hear the pounding of his horse's hooves and see him come charging up the hill at his usual breakneck speed. But the minutes slipped by, and Gerald did not come. She looked down the road for him, the pain in her heart swelling up again. Oh, it can't be true, she thought. Why doesn't he come? Her eyes followed the winding road, blood red now after the morning rain. In her thought she traced its course as it ran down the hill to the sluggish Flint River, through the tangled swampy bottoms and up the next hill to 12 Oaks where Ashley lived. That was all the road meant now, a road to Ashley and the beautiful white columned house that crowned the hill like a Greek temple. Oh, Ashley. Ashley, she thought, and her heart beat faster. Some of the cold sense of bewilderment and disaster that had weighted her down since the Tarleton boys told her their gossip was pushed into the background of her mind. And in its place crept the fever that had possessed her for 2 years. It seemed strange now that when she was growing up Ashley had never seemed so very attractive to her. In childhood days, she had seen him come and go and never given him a thought. But since that day 2 years ago when Ashley, newly home from his 3 years grand tour in Europe, had called to pay his respects, she had loved him. It was as simple as that. She had been on the front porch and he had ridden up the long avenue, dressed in gray broadcloth with a wide black cravat setting off his frilled shirt to perfection. Even now, she could recall each detail of his dress, how brightly his boots shone, the head of a Medusa in cameo on his cravat pin, the wide Panama hat that was instantly in his hand. When he saw her, he had alighted and tossed his bridle reins to a pickaninny and stood looking up at her, his drowsy gray eyes wide with a smile and the sun so bright on his blonde hair that it seemed like a cap of shining silver. And he said, "So you've grown up, Scarlett." And, coming lightly up the steps, he had kissed her hand. And his voice. She would never forget the leap of her heart as she heard it, as if for the first time, drawling, resonant, musical. She had wanted him, in that first instant, wanted him as simply and unreasoningly as she wanted food to eat, horses to ride and a soft bed on which to lay herself. For 2 years he had squired her about the county, to balls, fish fries, picnics and court days, never so often as the Tarleton twins or Kate Calvert, never so importunate as the younger Fontaine boys, but, still, never the week went by that Ashley did not come calling at Tara. True, he never made love to her, nor did the clear gray eyes ever glow with that hot light Scarlett knew so well in other men. And yet she knew he loved her. She could not be mistaken about it. Instinct stronger than reason and knowledge born of experience told her that he loved her. Too often she had surprised him when his eyes were neither drowsy nor remote, when he looked at her with a yearning and a sadness which puzzled her. She knew he loved her. Why did he not tell her so? That she could not understand. But there were so many things about him that she did not understand. He was courteous always, but aloof, remote. No one could ever tell what he was thinking about, Scarlett least of all. In a neighborhood where everyone said exactly what he thought as soon as he thought it, Ashley's quality of reserve was exasperating. He was as proficient as any of the other young men in the usual county diversions, hunting, gambling, dancing and politics, and was the best rider of them all, but he differed from all the rest in that these pleasant activities were not the end and aim of life to him. And he stood alone in his interest in books and music and his fondness for writing poetry. Oh, why was he so handsomely blonde, so courteously aloof, so maddeningly boring with his talk about Europe and books and music and poetry and things that interested her not at all and yet so desirable? Night after night, when Scarlett went to bed after sitting on the front porch in the semi-darkness with him, she tossed restlessly for hours, and comforted herself only with the thought that the very next time he saw her he certainly would propose. But the next time came and went, and the result was nothing except that the fever possessing her rose higher and hotter. She loved him and she wanted him and she did not understand him. She was as forthright and simple as the winds that blew over Tara and the yellow river that wound about it, and to the end of her days she would never be able to understand a complexity. And now, for the first time in her life, she was facing a complex nature. For Ashley was born of a line of men who used their leisure for thinking, not doing, for spinning brightly colored dreams that had in them no touch of reality. He moved in an inner world that was more beautiful than Georgia and came back to reality with reluctance. He looked on people, and he neither liked nor disliked them. He looked on life and was neither heartened nor saddened. He accepted the universe and his place in it for what they were and, shrugging, turned to his music and books and his better world. Why he should have captivated Scarlett when his mind was a stranger to hers she did not know. The very mystery of him excited her curiosity like a door that had neither lock nor key. The things about him which she could not understand only made her love him more, and his odd, restrained courtship only served to increase her determination to have him for her own. That he would propose some day she had never doubted, for she was too young and too spoiled ever to have known defeat. And now, like a thunderclap, had come this horrible news. Ashley to marry Melanie. It couldn't be true. Why, only last week, when they were riding home at twilight from Fairhill, he had said, "Scarlett, I have something so important to tell you that I hardly know how to say it." She had cast down her eyes demurely, her heart beating with wild pleasure, thinking the happy moment had come. Then he had said, "Not now. We're nearly home and there isn't time." Oh, Scarlett, what a coward I am. And putting spurs to his horse, he had raced her up the hill to Tara. Scarlett, sitting on the stump, thought of those words which had made her so happy, and suddenly they took on another meaning, a hideous meaning. Suppose it was the news of his engagement he had intended to tell her. Oh, if Pa would only come home. She could not endure the suspense another moment. She looked impatiently down the road again, and again she was disappointed. The sun was now below the horizon and the red glow at the rim of the world faded into pink. The sky above turned slowly from azure to the delicate blue-green of a robin's egg. And the unearthly stillness of rural twilight came stealthily down about her. Shadowy dimness crept over the countryside. The red furrows and the gashed red road lost their magical blood color and became plain brown earth. Across the road, in the pasture, the horses, mules, and cows stood quietly with heads over the split-rail fence, waiting to be driven to the stables and supper. They did not like the dark shade of the thickets hedging the pasture creek, and they twitched their ears at Scarlett as if appreciative of human companionship. In the strange half-light, the tall pines of the river swamp, so warmly green in the sunshine, were black against the pastel sky, an impenetrable row of black giants hiding the slow yellow water at their feet. On the hill across the river, the tall white chimneys of the Wilkes home faded gradually into the darkness of the thick oaks surrounding them, and only far-off pinpoints of supper lamps showed that a house was here. The warm damp balminess of spring encompassed her sweetly with the moist smells of new plowed earth and all the fresh green things pushing up to the air. Sunset and spring and new-fledged greenery were no miracle to Scarlett. Their beauty she accepted as casually as the air she breathed and the water she drank, for she had never consciously seen beauty in anything but women's faces, horses, silk dresses and like tangible things. Yet the serene half-light over Tara's well-kept acres brought a measure of quiet to her disturbed mind. She loved this land so much, without even knowing she loved it as she loved her mother's face under the lamp at prayer time. Still there was no sign of Gerald on the quiet winding road. If she had to wait much longer, Mammy would certainly come in search of her and bully her into the house. But even as she strained her eyes down the darkening road, she heard a pounding of hooves at the bottom of the pasture hill and saw the horses and cows scatter in fright. Gerald O'Hara was coming home across country and at top speed. He came up the hill at a gallop on his thick-barreled, long-legged hunter, appearing in the distance like a boy on a too-large horse, his long white hair standing out behind him. He urged the horse forward with crop and loud cries. Filled with her own anxieties, she nevertheless watched him with affectionate pride, for Gerald was an excellent horseman. I wonder why he always wants to jump fences when he's had a few drinks, she thought. And after that fall he had right here last year when he broke his knee. You'd think he'd learn. Especially when he promised Mother on oath he'd never jump again. Scarlett had no awe of her father and felt him more her contemporary than her sisters. For jumping fences and keeping it a secret from his wife gave him a boyish pride and guilty glee that matched her own pleasure in outwitting Mammy. She rose from her seat to watch him. The big horse reached the fence, gathered himself and soared over as effortlessly as a bird, his rider yelling enthusiastically, his crop beating the air, his white curls jerking out behind him. Gerald did not see his daughter in the shadow of the trees, and he drew rein in the road, patting his horse's neck with approbation. "There's none in the county can touch you, nor in the state," he informed his mount. With pride, the brogue of County Meath still heavy on his tongue in spite of 39 years in America. Then he hastily set about smoothing his hair and settling his ruffled shirt and his cravat which had slipped awry behind one ear. Scarlett knew these hurried preenings were being made with an eye toward meeting his wife with the appearance of a gentleman who had ridden sedately home from a call on a neighbor. She knew also that he was presenting her with just the opportunity she wanted for opening the conversation without revealing her true purpose. She laughed aloud. As she had intended, Gerald was startled by the sound, then he recognized her, and a look both sheepish and defiant came over his florid face. He dismounted with difficulty, because his knee was stiff, and, slipping the reins over his arm, stumped toward her. "Well, missy," he said, pinching her cheek, "so, you've been spying on me and, like your sister Sue Ellen last week, you'll be telling your mother on me." There was indignation in his hoarse bass voice but also a wheedling note, and Scarlett teasingly clicked her tongue against her teeth as she reached out to pull his cravat into place. His breath in her face was strong with bourbon whiskey mingled with a faint fragrance of mint. Accompanying him also were the smells of chewing tobacco, well-oiled leather, and horses, a combination of odors that she always associated with her father and instinctively liked in other men. "No, Pa, I'm no tattletale like Sue Ellen," she assured him, standing off to view his rearranged attire with a judicious air. Gerald was a small man, little more than 5 feet tall, but so heavy of barrel and thick of neck that his appearance, when seated, led strangers to think him a larger man. His thick-set torso was supported by short sturdy legs, always encased in the finest leather boots procurable and always planted wide apart like a swaggering small boy's. Most small people who take themselves seriously are a little ridiculous, but the bantam cock is respected in the barnyard, and so it was with Gerald. No one would ever have the temerity to think of Gerald O'Hara as a ridiculous little figure. He was 60 years old and his crisp curly hair was silver white, but his shrewd face was unlined and his hard little blue eyes were young with the unworried youthfulness of one who has never taxed his brain with problems more abstract than how many cards to draw in a poker game. His was as Irish a face as could be found in the length and breadth of the homeland he had left so long ago, round, high-colored, short-nosed, wide-mouthed and belligerent. Beneath his choleric exterior Gerald O'Hara had the tenderest of hearts. He could not bear to see a slave pouting under a reprimand, no matter how well deserved, or hear a kitten mewing or a child crying, but he had a horror of having this weakness discovered. That everyone who met him did discover his kindly heart within 5 minutes was unknown to him, and his vanity would have suffered tremendously if he had found it out, for he liked to think that when he bawled orders at the top of his voice everyone trembled and obeyed. It had never occurred to him that only one voice was obeyed on the plantation, the soft voice of his wife Ellen. It was a secret he would never learn, for everyone from Ellen down to the stupidest field hand was in a tacit and kindly conspiracy to keep him believing that his word was law. Scarlett was impressed less than anyone else by his tempers and his roarings. She was his oldest child and, now that Gerald knew there would be no more sons to follow the 3 who lay in the family burying ground, he had drifted into a habit of treating her in a man-to-man manner which she found most pleasant. She was more like her father than her younger sisters, for Karine, who had been born Caroline Irene, was delicate and dreamy, and Sue Ellen, christened Susan Eleanor, prided herself on her elegance and ladylike deportment. Moreover, Scarlett and her father were bound together by a mutual suppression agreement. If Gerald caught her climbing a fence instead of walking half a mile to a gate, or sitting too late on the front steps with a beau, he castigated her personally and with vehemence, but he did not mention the fact to Ellen or to Mammy. And when Scarlett discovered him jumping fences after his solemn promise to his wife, or learned the exact amount of his losses at poker, as she always did from county gossip, she refrained from mentioning the fact at the supper table in the artfully artless manner Sue Ellen had. Scarlett and her father each assured the other solemnly that to bring such matters to the ears of Ellen would only hurt her, and nothing would induce them to wound her gentleness. Scarlett looked at her father in the fading light, and, without knowing why, she found it comforting to be in his presence. There was something vital and earthy and coarse about him that appealed to her. Being the least analytic of people, she did not realize that this was because she possessed in some degree these same qualities, despite 16 years of effort on the part of Ellen and Mammy to obliterate them. "You look very presentable now," she said, "and I don't think anyone will suspect you've been up to your tricks unless you brag about them. But it does seem to me that after you broke your knee last year, jumping that same fence, well, may I be damned if I'll have me own daughter telling me what I shall jump and not jump," he shouted, giving her cheek another pinch. "It's me own neck, so it is. And besides, Missy, what are you doing out here without your shawl?" Seeing that he was employing familiar maneuvers to extricate himself from unpleasant conversation, she slipped her arm through his and said, "I was waiting for you. I didn't know you would be so late. I just wondered if you had bought Dilchet." "Bought her I did, and the price has ruined me. Bought her and her little wench, Prissy." John Wilkes was for almost giving them away, but never will I have it said that Gerald O'Hara used friendship in a trade. "I made him take 3,000 for the two of them. In the name of heaven, Pa, 3,000. And you didn't need to buy Prissy." "Has the time come when me own daughters sit in judgment on me?" shouted Gerald rhetorically. "Prissy is a likely little wench, and so I know her." "She's a sly, stupid creature," Scarlett rejoined calmly, unimpressed by his uproar. "And the only reason you bought her was because Dilchet asked you to buy her." Gerald looked crestfallen and embarrassed, as always when caught in a kind deed, and Scarlett laughed outright at his transparency. "Well, what if I did? Was there any use buying Dilchet if she was going to mope about the child? Well, never again will I let a darky on this place marry off it. It's too expensive. Well, come on, puss, let's go into supper." The shadows were falling thicker now, the last greenish tinge had left the sky and a slight chill was displacing the balminess of spring. But Scarlett loitered, wondering how to bring up the subject of Ashley without permitting Gerald to suspect her motive. This was difficult, for Scarlett had not a subtle bone in her body, and Gerald was so much like her he never failed to penetrate her weak subterfuges, even as she penetrated his. And he was seldom tactful in doing it. "How are they all over at 12 Oaks?" "About as usual. Kate Calvert was there and, after I settled about Dilchet, we all sat on the gallery and had several toddies. Kate has just come from Atlanta, and it's all upset. They are there and talking war and—" Scarlett sighed. "If Gerald once got on the subject of war and secession, it would be ours." Before he relinquished it, she broke in with another line. "Did they say anything about the barbecue tomorrow?" "Now that I think of it, they did. Miss what's her name, the sweet little thing who was here last year, you know, Ashley's cousin. Oh, yes, Miss Melanie Hamilton, that's the name. She and her brother Charles have already come from Atlanta and—" "Oh, so she did come." "She did, and a sweet quiet thing she is, with never a word to say for herself, like a woman should be. Come now, daughter, don't lag. Your mother will be hunting for us." Scarlett's heart sank at the news. She had hoped against hope that something would keep Melanie Hamilton in Atlanta where she belonged, and the knowledge that even her father approved of her sweet quiet nature, so different from her own, forced her into the open. Was Ashley there, too? He was. Gerald let go of his daughter's arm and turned, peering sharply into her face. "And if that's why you came out here to wait for me, why didn't you say so without beating around the bush?" Scarlett could think of nothing to say, and she felt her face growing red with annoyance. Well, speak up. Still she said nothing, wishing that it was permissible to shake one's father and tell him to hush his mouth. He was there and he asked most kindly after you, as did his sisters, and said they hoped nothing would keep you from the barbecue tomorrow. I'll warrant nothing will, he said shrewdly. And now, daughter, what's all this about you and Ashley? There is nothing, she said shortly, tugging at his arm. Let's go in, Pa. So now 'tis you wanting to go in, he observed. But here I'm going to stand till I'm understanding you. Now that I think of it, 'tis strange you've been recently. Has he been trifling with you? Has he asked to marry you? No, she said shortly. Nor will he, said Gerald. Fury flamed in her, but Gerald waved her quiet with a hand. Hold your tongue, miss. I had it from John Wilkes this afternoon in the strictest confidence that Ashley's to marry Miss Melanie. It's to be announced tomorrow. Scarlett's hand fell from his arm. So it was true. A pain slashed at her heart as savagely as a wild animal's fangs. Through it all, she felt her father's eyes on her, a little pitying, a little annoyed at being faced with a problem for which he knew no answer. He loved Scarlett, but it made him uncomfortable to have her forcing her childish problems on him for a solution. Ellen knew all the answers. Scarlett should have taken her troubles to her. Is it a spectacle you've been making of yourself of all of us, he bawled, his voice rising as always in moments of excitement. Have you been running after a man who's not in love with you, when you could have any of the bucks in the county? Anger and her pride drove out some of the pain. I haven't been running after him. It just surprised me. It's lying you are, said Gerald, and then, peering at her stricken face, he added in a burst of kindliness, I'm sorry, daughter. But after all, you are nothing but a child and there's lots of other beaux. Mother was only 15 when she married you, and I'm 16, said Scarlett, her voice muffled. Your mother was different, said Gerald. She was never flighty like you. Now come. Daughter, cheer up, and I'll take you to Charleston next week to visit your Aunt Eulalie. And, what with all the hullabaloo they are having over there about Fort Sumter, you'll be forgetting about Ashley in a week. He thinks I'm a child, thought Scarlett, grief and rage choking utterance, and he's only got to dangle a new toy and I'll forget my bumps. Now, don't be jerking your chin at me, warned Gerald. If you had any sense you'd have married Stuart or Brant Tarleton long ago. Think it over, daughter. Marry one of the twins and then the plantations will run together and Jim Tarleton and I will build you a fine house, right where they join, in that big pine grove and will you stop treating me like a child, cried Scarlett. I don't want to go to Charleston. Or have a house or marry the twins. I only want she caught herself but not in time. Gerald's voice was strangely quiet and he spoke slowly as if drawing his words from a store of thought seldom used. It's only Ashley you're wanting, and you'll not be having him. And if he wanted to marry you, 'twould be with misgivings that I'd say yes, for all the fine friendship that's between me and John Wilkes. And, seeing her startled look, he continued, I want my girl to be happy and you wouldn't be happy with him. Oh, I would. I would. That you would not, daughter. Only when like marries like can there be any happiness. Scarlett had a sudden treacherous desire to cry out, but you've been happy, and you and mother aren't alike, but she repressed it, fearing that he would box her ears for her impertinence. Our people and the Wilkes are different, he went on slowly, fumbling for words. The Wilkes are different from any of our neighbors, different from any family I ever knew. They are queer folk, and it's best that they marry their cousins and keep their queerness to themselves. Why, Pa, Ashley is not. Hold your whist, puss. I said nothing against the lad, for I like him. And when I say queer, it's not crazy I'm meaning. He's not queer like the Calverts who'd gamble everything they have on a horse, or the Tarletons who turn out a drunkard or two in every litter, or the Fontaines who are hot-headed little brutes and after murdering a man for a fancied slight. That kind of queerness is easy to understand, for sure, and but for the grace of God Gerald O'Hara would be having all those faults. And I don't mean that Ashley would run off with another woman, if you were his wife, or beat you. You'd be happier if he did, for at least you'd be understanding that. But he's queer in other ways, and there's no understanding him at all. I like him, but it's neither heads nor tails I can make of most he says. Now, puss, tell me true, do you understand his folderol about books and poetry and music and oil paintings and such foolishness? Oh, Pa, cried Scarlett impatiently, if I married him, I'd change all that. Oh, you would you now, said Gerald testily, shooting a sharp look at her. Then it's little enough you are knowing of any man living, let alone Ashley. No wife has ever changed a husband one whit, and don't you be forgetting that. And as for changing a Wilkes God's nightgown, daughter, the whole family is that way, and they've always been that way. And probably always will. I tell you they're born queer. Look at the way they go tearing up to New York and Boston to hear operas and see oil paintings. And ordering French and German books by the crate from the Yankees. And there they sit, reading and dreaming the dear God knows what, when they'd be better spending their time hunting and playing poker as proper men should. There's nobody in the county sits a horse better than Ashley, said Scarlett, furious at the slur of effeminacy flung on Ashley, nobody except maybe his father. And as for poker, didn't Ashley take $200 away from you just last week in Jonesboro? The Calvert boys have been blabbing again, Gerald said resignedly, else you'd not be knowing the amount. Ashley can ride with the best and play poker with the best, that's me, puss. And I'm not denying that when he sets out to drink he can put even the Tarletons under the table. He can do all those things, but his heart's not in it. That's why I say he's queer. Scarlett was silent and her heart sank. She could think of no defense for this last, for she knew Gerald was right. Ashley's heart was in none of the pleasant things he did so well. He was never more than politely interested in any of the things that vitally interested everyone else. Rightly interpreting her silence, Gerald patted her arm and said triumphantly, there. Now, Scarlett. You admit 'tis true. What would you be doing with a husband like Ashley? 'Tis moonstruck they all are, all the Wilkes. And then, in a wheedling tone, when I was mentioning the Tarletons the while ago, I wasn't pushing them. They're fine lads, but if it's Kate Calvert you're setting your cap after, why, 'tis the same with me. The Calverts are good folk, all of them, for all the old man marrying a Yankee. And when I'm gone, whist, darlin', listen to me. I'll leave terror to you and Cade. I wouldn't have Cade on a silver tray, cried Scarlett in fury. And I wish you'd quit pushing him at me. I don't want Tara or any old plantations don't amount to anything. When she was going to say when you haven't the man you want, but Gerald, incensed by the cavalier way in which she treated his proffered gift, the thing which, next to Ellen, he loved best in the whole world, uttered a roar. Do you stand there, Scarlett O'Hara, and tell me that Tara, that land doesn't amount to anything. Scarlett nodded obstinately. Her heart was too sore to care whether or not she put her father in a temper. Land is the only thing in the world that amounts to anything, he shouted, his thick short arms making wide gestures of indignation, for 'tis the only thing in this world that lasts, and don't you be forgetting it. 'Tis the only thing worth working for, worth fighting for, worth dying for. Oh, Pa, she said disgustedly, you talk like an Irishman. Have I ever been ashamed of it? No, 'tis proud I am. And don't be forgetting that you are half Irish, miss. And to anyone with a drop of Irish blood in them, the land they live on is like their mother. 'Tis ashamed of you I am this minute. I offer you the most beautiful land in the world, saving County Meath in the old country, and what do? You sniff. Gerald had begun to work himself up into a pleasurable shouting rage when something in Scarlett's woebegone face stopped him. But there, you're young. 'Twill come to you, this love of land. There's no getting away from it, if you're Irish. You're just a child and bothered about your beaus. When you're older, you'll be seeing how 'tis. Now, do you be making up your mind about Kate or the twins or one of Evan Monroe's young bucks, and see how fine I turn you out? Oh, Pa. By this time, Gerald was thoroughly tired of the conversation and thoroughly annoyed that the problem should be upon his shoulders. He felt aggrieved, moreover, that Scarlett should still look desolate after being offered the best of the county boys, and Tara, too. Gerald liked his gifts to be received with clapping of hands and kisses. Now, none of your pouts, miss. It doesn't matter who you marry, as long as he thinks like you and is a gentleman and a southerner and prideful. For a woman, love comes after marriage. Oh, Pa, that's such an old country notion. And a good notion it is. All this American business of running around marrying for love. Like servants, like Yankees. The best marriages are when the parents choose for the girl. For how can a silly piece like yourself tell a good man from a scoundrel? Now, look at the Wilkes. What's kept them prideful and strong all these generations? Why, marrying the likes of themselves, marrying the cousins their family always expects them to marry. Oh, cried Scarlett, fresh pain striking her as Gerald's words brought home the terrible inevitability of the truth. Gerald looked at her bowed head and shuffled his feet uneasily. It's not crying you are, he questioned, fumbling clumsily at her chin, trying to turn her face upward, his own face furrowed with pity. No, she cried vehemently, jerking away. It's lying you are, and I'm proud of it. I'm glad there's pride in you, puss. And I want to see pride in you tomorrow at the barbecue. I'll not be having the county gossiping and laughing at you for mooning your heart out about a man who never gave you a thought beyond friendship. He did give me a thought, thought Scarlett, sorrowfully in her heart. Oh, a lot of thoughts? I know he did. I could tell. If I'd just had a little longer, I know I could have made him say oh, if it only wasn't that the Wilkes always feel that they have to marry their cousins. Gerald took her arm and passed it through his. We'll be going into supper now, and all this is between us. I'll not be worrying your mother with this, nor do you do it, either. Blow your nose, daughter. Scarlett blew her nose on her torn handkerchief, and they started up the dark drive arm in arm, the horse following slowly. Near the house, Scarlett was at the point of speaking again when she saw her mother in the dim shadows of the porch. She had on her bonnet, shawl, and mittens, and behind her was Mammy, her face like a thundercloud, holding in her hand the black leather bag in which Ellen O'Hara always carried the bandages and medicines she used in doctoring the slaves. Mammy's lips were large and pendulous and, when indignant, she could push out her lower one to twice its normal length. It was pushed out now, and Scarlett knew that Mammy was seething over something of which she did not approve. "Mr. O'Hara," called Ellen as she saw the two coming up the driveway. Ellen belonged to a generation that was formal even after 17 years of wedlock and the bearing of 6 children. "Mr. O'Hara, there is illness at the Slattery house. Emmy's baby has been born and is dying and must be baptized. I am going there with Mammy to see what I can do." Her voice was raised questioningly, as though she hung on Gerald's assent to her plan, a mere formality but one dear to the heart of Gerald. "In the name of God," blustered Gerald. "Why should those white trash take you away? Just at your supper hour and just when I'm wanting to tell you about the war talk that's going on in Atlanta. Go, Mrs. O'Hara. You'd not rest easy on your pillow the night if there was trouble abroad and you not there to help. She don't never get no rest on her pillar for hoppin' up at night time nursin' niggers and po wi trash dat could tend to dies off," grumbled Mammy in a monotone as she went down the stairs toward the carriage which was waiting in the side drive. "Take my place at the table, dear," said Ellen, patting Scarlett's cheek softly with a mittened hand. In spite of her choked-back tears, Scarlett thrilled to the never-failing magic of her mother's touch, to the faint fragrance of lemon verbena sachet that came from her rustling silk dress. To Scarlett, there was something breathtaking about Ellen O'Hara, a miracle that lived in the house with her and awed her and charmed and soothed her. Gerald helped his wife into the carriage and gave orders to the coachman to drive carefully. Toby, who had handled Gerald's horses for 20 years, pushed out his lips in mute indignation at being told how to conduct his own business. Driving off, with Mammy beside him, each was a perfect picture of pouting African disapproval. "If I didn't do so much for those trashy Slatteries that they'd have to pay money for elsewhere," fumed Gerald, "they'd be willing to sell me their miserable few acres of swamp bottom, and the county would be well rid of them." Then, brightening, in anticipation of one of his practical jokes, "Come, daughter, let's go tell Pork that instead of buying Dulce, I've sold him to John Wilkes." He tossed the reins of his horse to a small pickaninny standing near and started up the steps. He had already forgotten Scarlett's heartbreak and his mind was only on plaguing his valet. Scarlett slowly climbed the steps after him, her feet leaden. She thought that, after all, a mating between herself and Ashley could be no queerer than that of her father and Ellen Robillard O'Hara. As always, she wondered how her loud, insensitive father had managed to marry a woman like her mother, for never were two people further apart in birth, breeding and habits of mind.